At 2 in the afternoon on October 6, 1973, 8,000 Egyptian infantry crossed the Suez Canal in rubber boats, while the entire Israeli state sat in synagogue, and the Israeli intelligence assessment that had governed a decade of defense planning simply ceased to exist. It was Yom Kippur. The roads were empty, the radio stations were silent, and the reserve army that constituted the real strength of Israel was scattered across a country that had shut itself down for the holiest day of its calendar. Along the Bar-Lev Line, some 450 men held fortifications designed for a tripwire, not a defense. The assumption that failed was called inside military intelligence, the concept. It held that Egypt would not attack until it possessed long-range bombers capable of striking Israeli airfields, and that Syria would not attack without Egypt. Both halves were reasonable. Both halves were wrong. Anwar Sadat had rebuilt his war around a different logic, a limited crossing under a dense umbrella of SA-2, SA-3, and SA-6 batteries that made the Sinai's eastern bank a place where the Israeli Air Force could not operate freely. He did not need to reach Tel Aviv. He needed to break the diplomatic freeze that had held since 1967, and for that, 10 kilometers of sand would do. By nightfall on the 6th, the 2nd and 3rd armies had bridgeheads across the canal. On the Golan, Syrian armor under Hafez al-Assad punched through in the south and drove toward the Sea of Galilee, and the 188th Barak Brigade was destroyed as a fighting formation, buying the hours it took for reservists to reach the line in civilian cars. Then came October 8th. Southern Command under Shmuel Gonen ordered a counterattack with Ariel Sharon's and Avraham Adan's divisions. It was badly coordinated, badly informed, and it failed against infantry with Saga missiles dug in on the sand ramparts. It remains the worst single day in the history of the Israel Defense Forces. That evening, Moshe Dayan walked into a cabinet meeting and said something about the destruction of the Third Temple. In our history, the phrase alarmed Golda Meir, and the cabinet declined to follow where it led. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. Because in this telling, the phrase does not merely alarm the cabinet, it carries it, and what followed over the next 72 hours would put two navies within sight of each other and change what the word ambiguity meant for the rest of the century. The room beneath the Kiryat in Tel Aviv, that Israelis called the pit, was not designed for the conversation that took place there on the night of October 8th. Dayan's argument was not that Israel would lose the war. It was that the cabinet could no longer be certain it would win one, and that two fronts collapsing at once was now inside the range of outcomes a responsible government had to plan against. Elazar disagreed. He believed the reserves would tell within days. But Elazar had believed the counterattack would work that morning, and the weight of that error sat on the table between them. What Israel possessed in October 1973 was never confirmed and has never been tested. A small arsenal, widely assessed at roughly a dozen devices, and the Jericho I missile developed from the Dassault MD-620 with French assistance before Paris turned away. 13 warheads, a range that covered Cairo and Damascus, and a doctrine of deliberate ambiguity that had served for a decade precisely because it was never spoken aloud. In the real war, Israel raised readiness quietly, a technical alert, carefully bounded, meant to be seen by almost no one. Here, Meir authorizes something else. The launchers roll out of their shelters at Mika in daylight. They are dispersed across open ground, elevated warheads mated, and nothing is done to conceal any of it. The decision is not a threat to any particular capital. It is a message written in a language that has exactly two fluent readers, and it is addressed to Washington as much as to Moscow. Israel is at the end of its conventional rope, and the alternative to resupply is not defeat. It is worth stating plainly what everyone in that room understood. This was not a decision to use anything. It was a decision to be seen. But a signal, once sent, belongs to whoever receives it. The confirmation reaches Moscow within hours, and it arrives twice. Once from overhead imagery, once from the sudden change in Israeli communications patterns that signals intelligence could read without decrypting a word. By the morning of October 9th, the Soviet leadership is looking at photographs of elevated launches in open desert and at a technical assessment that does not hedge. The disagreement in the Politburo is not about what Israel has done. It is about why. Defense Minister Andrei Grechko reads it as coercion aimed at Damascus, a demand that Assad halt on the Golan or accept a risk no Syrian government could accept. Andrei Gromyko reads it differently. He sees a lever aimed past the Arabs entirely at an American administration that has not yet committed to resupply and now cannot afford not to. Both readings are plausible. Both are probably partly true. Leonid Brezhnev does not choose between them, because from where he sits the distinction does not matter. Either Israel is coercing a Soviet client with nuclear weapons, or Israel is extorting the United States into an airlift using Soviet clients as the hostage. In both cases, the Soviet Union is being handed an outcome it did not agree to. The 7 airborne divisions that in our history went on alert late in October go on alert on October 9th, and this time the alert has a destination. Transports begin loading at Nikolaev and in the Caucasus. Nobody in Moscow believes this leads to a nuclear exchange. That belief is the most dangerous thing in the room. Washington in October 1973 was a government being eaten alive from the inside. Richard Nixon was consumed by Watergate. On October 10th, Spiro Agnew resigned the vice presidency over an unrelated bribery case. The Saturday Night Massacre lay 10 days ahead. Henry Kissinger held both the State Department and the National Security Council, and in practice ran the crisis alone. Kissinger's instinct is the one he acted on in reality. Raise the alert enough to be unmistakable, not so much as to be irreversible. Defcon 3 is a signal. It moves forces visibly, and it can be walked back. He argues for it on the evening of the 9th, in the same terms he would use 2 weeks later in the timeline we actually inhabit. He is overruled. It is the first time in the crisis that Nixon overrules him, and the reasons are not entirely strategic. A president facing impeachment cannot be seen to have flinched. A president whose vice president is resigning cannot afford an alert that Moscow might read as theater. The order goes out on October 10th for Defcon 2, the highest condition American forces have held since the Cuban Missile Crisis, one step below general war. Bombers disperse. The 6th Fleet goes to full readiness. Strategic Air Command aircraft go to airborne alert, and here the crisis acquires the quality that makes it genuinely dangerous. Both superpowers have now taken steps calibrated to be visible. Neither has taken a step calibrated to be reversible. The 5th Escadra had shadowed the 6th Fleet all war, close enough that sailors on both sides could read hull numbers without glasses. That was normal. What happens between October 10th and October 12th is not. The Soviet squadron in the eastern Mediterranean grows past 90 hulls. American carrier groups concentrate south of Crete and east of Cyprus. The shadowing distance closes from miles to hundreds of yards, and Soviet surface units adopt the posture their doctrine reserved for a first salvo. Bows on. Missile directors trained. American aircraft fly reconnaissance profiles that cannot be distinguished on radar from attack profiles. Neither navy has orders to fire. Both navies have orders that make firing possible within seconds of a decision neither government has yet made. Meanwhile, the airlift begins. Soviet transports carrying elements of the airborne divisions transit Turkish and Yugoslav airspace toward Egyptian fields, and American fighters rise to meet and escort them, not to stop them, which nobody in Washington has authorized, but to be photographed alongside them. Ankara protests the overflights and is ignored by both sides. Western Europe watches from the far shore of its own sea. Pompidou has embargoed arms to Israel since 1967. Heath has withheld resupply. Brandt discovers that American aircraft are transiting his territory on missions he was not consulted about. They are dependent on Arab oil, uninformed by Washington, and geographically closer to the confrontation than either power running it. Their conclusion that the alliance protects them from everything except the decisions of their protector will outlive the crisis by decades. What breaks the deadlock comes from the one capital nobody in Moscow or Washington was watching. Anwar Sadat had gone to war for a political result. He had said so in terms his own generals sometimes found maddening. The crossing was meant to shatter the assumption that the 1967 lines were permanent and force a negotiation, and by the second week of October, he had substantially achieved it. The Egyptian army had crossed a water obstacle the world called impassable and held its bridgeheads for a week. Then Soviet paratroopers began landing in the Nile Delta, and Sadat understood something that reframed his entire war. The divisions were not there to defend Egypt. They were there so that Moscow would have physical standing in whatever came next, chips on a table where the other player was Washington, and the stake was an Israeli arsenal that was now, functionally, a matter of public record. Egypt had become terrain. Sadat had already begun quietly probing Washington in the real war. Here he does it faster and with more to offer. Through intermediaries, he proposes a ceasefire on the existing lines, in place, without preconditions, and, unstated but understood, without asking the Soviet Union first. For Kissinger, it is the first thing in 5 days that opens rather than closes. A ceasefire Egypt requests is a ceasefire Moscow cannot easily refuse without exposing that its divisions are serving Soviet purposes rather than Arab ones. For Assad, still fighting on the Golan, and closest of anyone to Israeli missiles that Damascus can now assume are aimed at it, the arithmetic is worse and the choice is narrower. Syria accepts and does not forgive. The guns stop on roughly the lines of October 13. There is no Israeli crossing to the west bank of the canal, no encirclement of the Third Army, no kilometer 101. Egypt ends the war holding ground it took, which is what Sadat wanted, and Israel ends it having not lost, which by October 8 was more than its cabinet had dared assume. The Soviet airborne divisions land in Egypt and then discover they have nowhere to go and nothing to do. They arrive to shape a crisis that ended before they finished deploying. Within 18 months, they are gone, and the Egyptian-Soviet relationship goes with them, earlier and more bitterly than in our history, because the humiliation is physical and witnessed. The bill arrives from Riyadh. King Faisal and the Arab producers impose the embargo and the production cuts, as they did in reality on October 17 and 20, but the terms are broader. This embargo is aimed not only at the United States, but at any state extending recognition to Israel's declared arsenal, an instrument built for a world in which Israeli nuclear weapons are no longer a rumor to be diplomatically ignored. Europe, already resentful of a crisis it was not consulted on, complies faster and more completely than Washington expects, and in Israel, the question that cannot be walked back. What do you do the morning after the whole world has seen your launches? You cannot unsee a photograph. Ambiguity had worked for a decade because it let everyone choose their own convenient belief. Washington could avoid a law it did not want to enforce. Arab governments could avoid a fact they could not answer. And Israel could hold a capability without holding a policy. Once the launches stood in daylight, every one of those conveniences was gone. So Israel does the only coherent thing left and formalizes what it revealed: a declared arsenal, a stated doctrine of last resort, and an end to the useful fiction. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, 5 years old and still setting, absorbs a permanent exception, not a violation Israel had never signed, but something worse for the regime's authority, a demonstration that the exception was survivable, that a state could cross the line openly, be sanctioned, and remain. The programs follow. Egypt, which had let its nuclear ambitions lapse because ambiguity let it, restarts them. The Shah's Iran accelerates a program that in our timeline stayed notional until 1979 and then changed hands. Iraq goes to Paris for the reactor it sought anyway and gets a more sympathetic hearing. None of these countries needed a new motive. They needed the disappearance of the old excuse for waiting, and October 1973 removed it. What makes this counterfactual worth sitting with is not that it was likely. It was not. It required a specific cabinet on a specific night to follow an argument to a conclusion it declined, in fact, to follow, and to be right about the danger while being wrong about the remedy. Dayan was not hysterical on October 8th. The IDF really had just had the worst day in its history, and the reserves really had not yet told. He was reasoning from what he knew at the hour he knew it, which is all any of these men were doing. Golda Meir's cabinet chose the quiet alert. The reserves arrived, the line held, and the arsenal stayed unspoken for another 50 years. The distance between that world and this one is not a battle or a treaty or a technology. It is a single meeting, held underground by exhausted people who could not know that the war had already turned.